Hi, my sweet friends, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. We're continuing reading from Swiss Family Robinson, starting with Chapter 32, Completion of 2 Farmhouses, a Lake, a Boat. The trees that I had chosen for the construction of my farmhouse embellishments were for the most part 1 foot in diameter in the trunk. They presented the form of a tolerably regular parallelogram, with its longest side to the sea, the length 24 feet, and the breadth 16. I cut little hollow places or mortises in the trunks at the distance of 10 feet, one above the other, to form 2 stories. The upper one I made a few inches shorter before than behind, that the roof might be in some degree shelving. I then inserted beams 5 inches in diameter, respectively, in the mortises, and thus formed the skeleton of my building. We next nailed some laths from tree to tree at equal distances from each other to form the roof, and placed on them, in mathematical order, a covering composed of pieces of the bark of trees cut into the shape of tiles and in a sloping position for the rain to run off in the wet season. As we had no great provision of iron nails, we used for the purpose the strong pointed thorn of the acacia, which we had discovered the day before. We cut down a quantity of them and laid them in the sun to dry, when they became as hard as iron and were of essential service to our undertaking. After our next meal, we resumed with ardor our undertaking of the farmhouse, which we continued without interruption for several days. We formed the walls with matted reeds interwoven with pliant laths to the height of 6 feet. The remaining space to the roof was enclosed with only a simple grating, that the air and light might be admitted. A door was placed in the middle of the front. We next arranged the interior with as much convenience as the shortness of the time and our reluctance to use all our timber would allow. We divided it halfway up by a partition wall into 2 unequal parts. The largest was intended for the sheep and goats, and the smallest for ourselves, when we should wish to pass a few days here. Excuse me. At the further end of the stable, we fixed a house for the fowls, and above it a sort of hayloft for the forage. Before the door of entrance we placed 2 benches, contrived as well as we could of laths and odd pieces of wood, that we might rest ourselves under the shade of the trees and enjoy the exquisite prospect which presented itself on all sides. Our own apartment was provided with a couple of the best bedsteads we could make of twigs of trees, raised upon 4 legs 2 feet from the ground, and these were destined to receive our cotton mattresses. Our aim was to content ourselves for the present with these slight hints of a dwelling, and to consider hereafter what additions, either of convenience or ornament, could be made, such as plastering, etc., etc. I had imagined we should accomplish what we wished at the farm in 3 or 4 days, but we found in the experiment that a whole week was necessary, and our victuals fell short before our work was done. We began to consider what remedy we could apply to so embarrassing a circumstance. I could not prevail upon myself to return to Falcon Stream before I had completed my intentions at the farm and the other objects of my journey. I had even come to the determination of erecting another building upon the site of Cape Disappointment. I therefore decided that on this trying occasion I would invest Fritz and Jack with the important mission. They were accordingly dispatched to Falcon Stream and to Tent House to fetch new supplies of cheese, ham, potatoes, dried fish, manioc bread for our subsistence, and also to distribute fresh food to the numerous animals we had left there. During the absence of our purveyors, I rambled with Ernest about the neighboring soil to make what new discoveries I could, and to procure, if possible, additions to our store of provisions. We followed the winding of a river toward the middle of the wall of rocks. Our course was interrupted by a marsh which bordered a small lake, the aspect of which was enchantingly picturesque. I perceived with joyful surprise that the whole surface of the swampy soil was covered with a kind of wild rice, ripe on the stalk, and which attracted the voracity of large flocks of birds. As we approached, a loud rustling was heard, and we distinguished on the wing bustards, Canada, heathfowl, and great numbers of smaller birds. We succeeded in bringing down 5 or 6 of them, and I was pleased to remark in Ernest a justness of aim that promised well for the future. Presently we saw Master Nips jump from Flora's back and smell along the ground among some thick-growing plants, then pluck off something with his 2 paws and eat of it voraciously. We ran to the spot to see what it could be, when, to the relief of our parched palates, we found he had discovered there the largest and finest kind of strawberry, which is called in Europe the chili, or pine strawberry. Pursuing our way a little further along the marsh, we reached the lake which we had descried with so much pleasure from a distance, and whose banks, being overgrown with thick underwood, were necessarily concealed from the momentary view we had leisure to take of surrounding objects, particularly as the lake was situated in a deep and abrupt valley. No one who is not a native of Switzerland can conceive the emotion which trembled at my heart as I contemplated this limpid, azure, undulating body of water, the faithful miniature of so many grand originals which I had probably lost sight of forever. My eyes swam with tears. Alas, a single glance upon the surrounding picture, the different characters of the trees, the vast ocean in the distance, destroyed the momentary illusion and brought back my ideas to the painful reality that I and mine were strangers in a desert island. Another sort of object now presented itself to confirm the certainty that we were no longer inhabitants of Europe. It was the appearance of a quantity of swans gliding over the surface of the lake, but their color, instead of white like those of our country, was a jetty black, and their plumage had so high a gloss as to produce, reflected on the water, the most astonishing effect. The 6 large feathers of the wings of this bird are white, exhibiting a singular contrast to the rest of the body. In other respects, these birds were remarkable, like those of Europe, for the haughty gracefulness of their motions and the voluptuous ease of their nature. We now began to look for the shortest path for returning to the farm, which we reached at the same time with Fritz and Jack, who had well performed the object of their journey. We, on our part, produced our offering of strawberries and our specimen of rice, which were welcomed with shouts of pleasure and surprise. We filled the stable with forage, laid a large provision of grain for the fowls within their house, and began arrangements for our departure. The following day, we took a silent leave of our animals and directed our course toward the eminence in the vicinity of Cape Disappointment. We ascended it and found it in every respect adapted to our wishes. From this eminence, we had a view over the country which surrounded Falcon Stream in one direction, and in others of a richly diversified extent of landscape, comprehending sea, land, and rocks. When we had paused for a short time upon the exhaustless beauties of the scene, we agreed with one voice that it should be on this spot we would build our second cottage. A spring of the clearest water issued from the soil near the summit and flowed over its sloping side, forming agreeable cascades in its rapid course. In short, every feature of the picture contributed to form a landscape worthy the homage of a taste the most delicate and refined. I presented my children with an appropriate word. "Let us build here," exclaimed I, and called the spot Arcadia, to which my wife and all agreed. We lost no time in again setting to work. Our experience at the farm enabled us to proceed with incredible rapidity, and our success was in every respect more complete. The building contained a dining room, 2 bedchambers, 2 stables, and a storeroom for preserving all kinds of provisions for man and beast. We formed the roof square with 4 sloped sides, and the whole had really the appearance of a European cottage, and was finished in the short space of 6 days. What now remained to be done was to fix on a tree fit for my project of a boat. After much search, I at length found one of prodigious size and in most respects suitable to my views. It was, however, no very encouraging prospect I had before me, being nothing less than the stripping off a piece of the bark that should be 18 feet in length and 5 in diameter, and now I found my rope ladder of signal service. We fastened it by one end to the nearest branches, and it enabled us to work with the saw, as might be necessary at any height from the ground. Accordingly, we cut quite round the trunk in 2 places, and then took a perpendicular slip from the whole length between the circles. By this means we could introduce the proper utensils for raising the rest by degrees till it was entirely separated. We toiled with increasing anxiety, at every moment dreading that we should not be able to preserve it from breaking or uninjured by our tools. When we had loosened about half, we supported it by means of cords and pulleys, and when all was at length detached, we let it down gently, and with joy beheld it lying safe on the grass. Our business was next to mold it to our purpose, while the substance continued moist and flexible. The boys observed that we had now nothing more to do than to nail a plank at each end, and our boat would be as complete as those used by the savages. But for my own part, I could not be contented with a mere roll of bark for a boat. And when I reminded them of the paltry figure it would make following the pinnace, I heard not another word about the further pains and trouble, and they asked eagerly for my instructions. I made them assist me to saw the bark in the middle of the 2 ends, the length of several feet. These 2 parts I folded over till they ended in a point. I kept them in this form by the help of the strong glue I had before made from fish bladders, and pieces of wood nailed fast over the whole. This operation tended to widen the boat in the middle, and thus render it of too flat a form, but this we counteracted by straining a cord all round, which again reduced it to the due proportion, and in this state we put it in the sun to harden and fix. Before our departure for Tent House, we collected several new plants for our kitchen garden, and lastly, we made another trip to the narrow strait at the end of the wall of rocks, resolved to plant there a sort of fortification of trees, which should produce the double effect of discouraging the invasion of savages and allowing us to keep our pigs on the other side and thus secure our different plantations from the chance of injury. We accomplished all these intentions to our entire satisfaction, and in addition, we placed a slight drawbridge across the river beyond the narrow pass which we could let down or take up at pleasure on our side. We now hastened our return to Arcadia, and after a night's repose we loaded the sledge with the boat and other matters and returned to Tent House. As soon as we had dispatched some necessary affairs, we resumed the completion of the boat. In 2 days she had received the addition of a keel, a neat lining of wood, a small flat floor, benches, a small mast and triangular sail, a rudder, and a thick coat of pitch on the outside, so that the first time we saw her in the water, we were all in ecstasies at the charming appearance she made. We had still 2 months in prospect before the rainy season, and we employed them for completing our abode, the grotto, with the exception of such ornaments as we might have time to think of during the long days of winter. We made the internal divisions of planks and that which separated us from the stables of stone to protect us from the offensive smell occasioned by the animals. Our task was difficult, but from habit it became easier every day. We took care to collect or manufacture a sufficient quantity of all sorts of materials, such as beams and planks, reeds and twigs for matting, pieces of gypsum for plaster, etc., etc. At length, the time of the rainy season was near at hand, and we thought of it with pleasure, as it would put us in possession of the enjoyments we had procured by such unremitting industry and fatigue. We plastered over the walls of the principal apartments on each side with the greatest care, finishing them by pressure with a flat, smooth board, and lastly, a wash of sides in the manner of the plasterers in Europe. This ornamental portion of our work amused us all so much that we began to think we might venture a step further in European luxury, and agreed that we would attempt to make some carpets with the hair of our goats. To this effect, we smoothed the ground in the rooms we intended to distinguish with great care, then spread over it some sailcloth, which my wife had joined in breadths, and fitted exactly. We next strewed the goat's hair, mixed with wool obtained from the sheep, over the whole. On this surface we threw some hot water in which a strong cement had been dissolved. The whole was then rolled up and was beaten for a considerable time with hard sticks. The sailcloth was now unrolled, and the inside again sprinkled, rolled, and beaten as before, and this process was continued until the substance had become a sort of felt, which could be separated from the sailcloth, and was lastly put in the sun to harden. We thus produced a very tolerable substitute for that enviable article of European comfort, a carpet. Of these we completed 2, one for our parlor and the other for our drawing room, as we jocosely named them, both of which were completely fit for our reception by the time the rains had set in. Thus, as will be perceived, we had made the first steps toward a condition of civilization, separated from society, condemned, perhaps, to pass the remainder of life in this desert island. We yet possessed the means of happiness. We had abundance of all the necessaries and many of the comforts desired by human beings. Chapter 33. Anniversary of our Deliverance. Motives for Thankfulness. One morning, having arisen earlier than the rest of my young family, I occupied myself by counting up the time that had passed away since our shipwreck. I calculated the dates with the utmost exactness, and I found that the next day would be the anniversary of that event. It was just 2 years since the hand of God had been extended over us to save us from a watery grave. I felt my mind filled with thanksgiving, and I resolved to celebrate the day with all the pomp our situation would permit. As I had not yet fixed upon the arrangements for our holiday, I said nothing about it to my family. Breakfast over, we proceeded to our different employments, and it was not until we were seated at supper that I announced in a pompous manner the holiday for the morrow. "Be ready," I said to my sons, "to celebrate the anniversary of the morrow. Let each one prepare himself as is proper for so great a day." These last words, joined to the announcement of a holiday, surprised and overjoyed my children. Their mother was not less astonished than they were to find that they had been on the island 2 years. On the morrow, we rose and dressed as decently as our scanty means afforded, and proceeded to breakfast. After our daily prayer, I announced to my family that the amusements of the day would conclude with the exercises which always terminated our holidays. "You have practiced for some time," said I, in wrestling, running, slinging, and horsemanship. The time has come when you shall receive the reward for your labors. You shall this day contend before your mother and me, and the crown shall be given to the victor. Come, champions, I added, elevating my voice. The barrier is open. Enter the lists. And you, trumpets, sound the horn of combat. As I said these last words, I turned to the little inlet where our geese and ducks were feeding, and the whole troop, frightened by my gestures and the tone of my voice, commenced a most deafening clamor and furnished my sons with a good joke to excite their risible faculties. I then organized the different combats which were to take place. First came firing at a mark. The materials for this were soon arranged by fixing in the ground a rudely shaped piece of wood with 2 bits of leather at each side of the top, which we called a kangaroo. Jack did wonders, either by chance or skill. He shot away one of the ears of our pretended kangaroo. Fritz just grazed the head, and Ernest lodged his ball in the middle of the body. The 3 shots were all worthy of praise. Another proof of skill was then made. It consisted in firing at a ball of cork which I threw up in the air. Ernest had the advantage here. He cut the ball to pieces. Fritz also shot well, but Jack could not hit it. We then tried the same thing with pistols, shortening the distance, and again I complimented my boys upon the progress they had made since last year. Slinging succeeded to the pistol exercise. Fritz carried off the prize. After that came archery, and here all, even little Francis, distinguished themselves. Next came the races, and I gave them for a course the distance between Family Bridge and Falcon's Nest. The one that arrives first, said I to the runners who gathered about me, will bring me, as proof of his victory, my knife, which I left on the table under the tree. I then gave the signal by clapping my hands 3 times. My 3 sons set out, Jack and Fritz, with all the impetuosity that marked their character. On the contrary, Ernest, who never did anything without reflecting, set off slowly at first, but gradually augmented his pace. I perceived that he had his elbows pressed firmly against his body, and I argued well from this little mark of prudence. The runners were absent about 3/4 of an hour. Jack returned first, but he was mounted on his buffalo in the onagra, and the ass followed him. Here now, said I, is this what you call racing? It was your legs and not those of the buffalo that I wished to exercise. Bah, cried he, jumping from the back of his courser. I knew I would never get there, so I left the course, and as the trial of horsemanship comes next, I thought that, as I was near Falcon's Nest, I would bring our coursers back with me. Fritz came next, all out of breath and covered with sweat, but he had not the knife, and it was Ernest who brought it me. How came you to have the knife, said I, when Fritz got here before you? The thing is simple, answered Ernest. In going, he could not long keep up the pace he started with, and soon stopped to breathe, while I ran on and got the knife. But in coming back, Fritz had learned a lesson. He pressed his arms against his sides and held his mouth shut, as he had seen me do, and then the victory depended on our relative strength. Fritz is 16, while I am but 13, and of course he arrived first. I praised the 2 boys for this skill, and declared Ernest conqueror. But now Jack, mounted on his buffalo, demanded that the equestrian exercises should commence, and he be allowed to repair the injury his reputation had sustained. To the saddle, my lads, he bellowed with all his force, and you shall see then who can best manage a courser. We shall then know whether you can sit your horse as well as you can exercise your legs. I hastened to comply with the request of the little braggart. Fritz mounted his onagra, and Ernest took the ass, but although they tried all their skill, Jack distanced them both. I was frightened myself to see with what boldness the boy abandoned himself to the powerful animal that bore him. To stop, charge, and turn was but a trifle to him. A practiced groom could not have managed a thoroughbred horse with more ease and grace than he did his bull. Just as I had declared the contest over and was about to proclaim Jack the victor, the little Francis rode into the arena mounted on his young bull, Broom, who was not more than 3 or 4 months old. My wife had made him a saddle of kangaroo skin with stirrups adjusted to his little legs, and there he sat, a whip in his right hand and the bridle of his animal in the left. Gentlemen, said the little cavalier, saluting us with a gracious bend, I have not contended with you thus far in any of the exercises of the day. Will you now permit Milo of Crotona to make a trial of his horsemanship before you? The assembly loudly applauded this little harangue, and the cavalier commenced to maneuver his courser. The boy was more cool and calm than those of his age are apt to be. But what I admired most was the docility of the animal. My wife looked on with maternal pride to see the success of her dear pupil, and Francis was unanimously proclaimed an excellent horseman. After the horsemanship, the swimming occupied some time. They also climbed the trees, and after we had finished our gymnastics, I announced that the rewards would now be distributed, and that the crowns would shade the brows of the victors. Everyone hastened to the grotto, which had been lighted up with all the torches we possessed. My wife, as queen of the day, was pompously installed in an elevated seat decorated with flowers, and I called up the laureates to receive the rewards which their mother distributed to each one as she impressed a tender kiss upon his forehead. Fritz, conqueror at shooting and swimming, received a superb English rifle and a hunting knife, which he had long wished for. Ernest had for the reward of the race a splendid gold watch. Jack, the cavalier, obtained a magnificent pair of steel spurs and a whip of whalebone. Little Francis received a pair of stirrups and a box of colors as a reward for the industry he had displayed in educating his bull. When this distribution was finished, I rose and, turning to my wife, presented her with a beautiful English workbox in which was contained all those little things that add so much to the comfort of an industrious woman, such as pins, needles, scissors, etc. "Receive," said I, "my excellent companion, also a reward for your services and endurance during the year well-deserved won, even though the tender love of myself and children may be in itself a sufficient reward." The day was finished as it had begun, with songs and expressions of joy. We were all happy, all contented. We all enjoyed that pure felicity which a life free from reproach had given us, and we all thanked in our hearts the Lord who had been so merciful toward us. We'll stop there for today and start next time with chapter 34. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.